There is a question that hangs over the flatlands of the Central Valley every summer like heat shimmer over asphalt, visible to anyone who cares to look but somehow never resolved. Why does the same acre of sandy loam produce a perfect melon one season and a field of cracked, weeping fruit the next, when the calendar says nothing changed? When the same seed went into the same ground under the same July sun? The packing shed managers had an answer. They had always had an answer. It was the answer of men who had spent their careers reading printouts rather than soil profiles. And it was stated with the flat authority of someone who has never been wrong because he has never been willing to notice when he was. Moisture variance, they said, distribution inconsistency in the irrigation infrastructure. They ordered new emitters, new pressure regulators, new scheduling software that cost more than 3 farm workers' annual wages combined. They wrote the cracked fruit off on their spreadsheets as a fixed cost of doing business in a hot climate. 30 tons in a bad August, sometimes more. The line on the ledger said breakage. The melons rotting in the field said something else entirely, but nobody was reading that language anymore. Nobody except one woman who worked a leased operation 7 miles down the same hardpan road and who had spent the last 4 years building something in an empty hog barn that everyone within 10 miles had already decided was a symptom of grief rather than a plan. Her name was Celestine Ruaro, and she was 53 years old in the summer she started. And she had recently buried her mother, and she had recently lost the lease on the larger parcel her family had farmed for 11 years. And she had recently been told by the regional cooperative extension agent that her remaining 12 acres were, in his professional opinion, not a viable standalone operation for any commodity crop with a meaningful margin. He said it gently. He said it with the particular tenderness of a man who believes he is delivering medicine rather than insult. And he left her a printed packet of resources about transitional support programs and diversification grants, and she set the packet on the workbench without opening it and went back to what she had been doing when he drove up. She was moving soil. Not dirt from the field, not compost from a windrow. She was moving a specific gray-brown medium from sealed 5-gallon buckets into long wooden trays she had built herself from salvaged pallet lumber. And she was doing it by hand, bucket by bucket, in the heat of an emptied hog barn that still smelled faintly of the animals who had last occupied it 8 years before. Her neighbor's boy, a 9-year-old named Emilio, who had taken to watching her through the barn's open side door most afternoons, asked her once what the gray stuff was. She told him it was a culture. He asked what kind. She said the kind that remembers. He thought about this and stayed. Her mother had kept a ledger. Not a farm ledger in the modern sense, not a spreadsheet or an accounting program, but a cloth-covered record book, the kind with marbled end papers and a ribbon marker, that she had maintained in cramped, careful handwriting for 31 years. The ledger was not a record of yields or expenses. It was a record of soil. Every season, Adela Ruaro had taken samples from 6 fixed points on the property, always the same 6 points. Always marked with painted river stones that she replaced when they faded, and she had recorded what she found. The texture, the color, the smell, the presence of earthworms per cubic foot, the behavior of a drop of water placed on a handful of the medium, whether it beaded or spread or sank. She had written observations in the margins in a mixture of standard Italian and the particular dialect of her home province, and she had drawn conclusions in plain language at the end of each year's section. The conclusions, read in sequence over 3 decades, told a story that no university extension bulletin had ever published, because no university had ever asked her. The story was this, that the sandy loam of that particular valley behaved not like a mineral medium, but like a living membrane, and that it had a memory. When it was given the right organisms in the right sequence, it held water at depth without holding it at the surface, and the roots of a melon plant sunk into it would never encounter the sudden wet-dry oscillation that split a melon's rind from the inside, like a seam giving way under pressure. When those organisms were absent, the soil was only sand dressed as soil, and no emitter spacing or pressure regulation in the world would make it behave otherwise. Adela had written the central observation in capital letters at the end of year 12, and she had underlined it twice, and the sentence read, The plant does not lie about what is underneath it. Celestine had read this sentence at the age of 17 and thought she understood it. At 53, burying her mother and reading the ledger again in one long night at the kitchen table, she understood that she had not understood it at all, and that she needed to start. What she was building in the hog barn was a fungal propagation system, not a commercial mushroom operation in the familiar sense, not oyster or shiitake grown on inoculated straw for the farmer's market, but a specific program of mycorrhizal network cultivation designed to be transplanted in living form into field soil, not sprinkled as dried powder from a bag, but moved in living community in the gray-brown medium she mixed to her mother's specification into the root zone of melon transplants before they ever touched the ground. The idea was not new. The science behind it was available in published form to anyone who read the right journals, and a handful of university researchers had written papers about it that had been accepted into peer-reviewed publications and subsequently ignored by every extension service and commodity cooperative in the region because the papers said the method required time, required attention, required a kind of knowledge that could not be packaged and shipped in a pallet of product. It required, in Adela Ruaro's plain language, someone who stayed still long enough to learn what the soil was already trying to do. Celestine had the journals. She had ordered them by interlibrary loan and read them in the evenings with her mother's ledger open beside them, and where the science confirmed what Adela had observed, she made a mark. There were a great many marks. The cooperative extension agent came back 6 weeks after his first visit, and he brought with him a man from the regional packing cooperative named Terence Wollstonecraft, who wore clean boots and drove a company truck with the cooperative's logo on the door, and who had the manner of a man accustomed to being the most informed person in any conversation he entered. Wollstonecraft stood in the doorway of the hog barn and looked at the rows of wooden trays and the temperature and humidity gauges mounted on the walls and the low-wattage grow lights that Celestine had strung from the rafters, and he said it looked like a lot of investment for a 12-acre operation. Celestine said it was not an investment, it was a preparation. He asked what she was preparing for. She said for August. He looked at the extension agent, and the extension agent looked at his packet of resource materials, and Wollstonecraft said that the split fruit loss in August was a systemic infrastructure issue that the cooperative had a capital improvement program in place to address, and that a 12-acre solo operation could not meaningfully affect a valley-wide problem through whatever she was doing with the trays of gray medium in a hog barn. He said this without cruelty, which was the thing Celestine found hardest to absorb. He said it with the warmth of a man sharing information he believed she needed and did not have. She said she appreciated his stopping by. She went back to the trays. He stood for a moment longer and then left, and the sound of his truck on the hardpan road faded into the general silence of the afternoon, and Emilio, who had heard everything from his post by the door, looked at Celestine and said nothing, which was the right thing. Word moved through the community the way it always moves in small farming districts, which is to say that it moved slowly and it moved wrong. By the end of that first summer, the story that circulated at the feed store and the diner and the cooperative's loading dock was that Celestine Ruaro had lost her nerve after losing her lease and her mother in the same year and was raising mushrooms in a barn, which was not a viable operation, which was a shame given what her family had built. A woman named Dora Pescatore, who had known Adela Ruaro for 40 years and who was genuinely kind in every way that kindness can fail a person, brought Celestine a covered dish and told her that nobody would think less of her if she took the transitional support money and leased the 12 acres to the Halverson boys, who were expanding their cantaloupe block and could use the ground. Celestine thanked her for the food. She said the lease stayed with her. Dora nodded with the expression of someone filing a sad fact away for later reference and drove home, and Celestine ate the food because it was good and because she was tired and went back to the barn. A man named Lupe Fuentes noticed. He was 61 years old and had spent 4 decades as a field supervisor for various operations up and down the valley and had developed over that time a habit of observing what was actually happening rather than what the commonly agreed account said was happening, and the two were rarely the same. He had driven past Celestine's operation 3 times a week for 6 months before he stopped and asked if he could come in. She said yes. He walked the barn slowly, reading the trays, reading the gauges, reading the ledger she had left open on the workbench. He asked 2 questions. He asked how long before field introduction, and she said spring. He asked what the inoculation density was per transplant cell, and she quoted her mother's ledger and one of the journal papers, and he nodded as if adding 2 columns of figures and finding them balanced. He said he could come 4 days a week if she needed a second set of hands. She said she paid in produce and whatever she could manage in cash, which was not much. He said the produce was enough. He started the following Monday, and he and Celestine worked side by side in the barn through the autumn and winter with the efficiency of people who have both learned that explaining yourself is a luxury that labor cannot always afford. The spring planting went into the ground in the way that a spring planting always goes into the ground, which is to say, with the sensory drama of soil newly turned and the quiet anxiety of seed and transplant committed to conditions not entirely in human control. But Celestine's transplants went in differently than any transplant that the Valley's standard practice would recognize, because each cell of each transplant flat had been inoculated 4 weeks prior with a measured portion of the living gray medium from the barn, and the root zone of every melon seedling was already threaded through with the high-fall networks that her mother's ledger had described as the thing the soil was trying to build when it was given enough time and not enough poison. She planted the 12 acres in 9 days, she and Lupe and Emilio, who had turned 10 and had taken on the flat-carrying work with the seriousness of a person who understands he is part of something without being able to name what it is. The neighbors planted in the same week. The Halverson boys planted 60 acres of the cooperative's standard variety with the cooperative's standard transplants and the cooperative's drip system running on the new scheduling software, and they planted with confidence, because the capital improvement program was complete, and the Extension Service had certified the new emitter layout, and the regional agronomist had issued a favorable outlook for the season. They planted 70,000 transplants in 3 days with a crew of 17 and a transplanter rig that cost more than Celestine's entire annual revenue, and by the end of the first week of May, the fields on both sides of the hardpan road were an identical sea of small green ovals against pale soil, and no one looking at them from the road would have known that any difference existed beneath the surface. The difference was entirely underground. It was invisible. It would remain invisible for 10 weeks. Celestine watched the fields the way her mother had described watching soil in the ledger, not with instruments, but with attention. She walked her rows in the early morning before the heat arrived, and she knelt periodically and pressed her fingers into the soil at the base of the plants and noted what she found, and cross-referenced it against the ledger's seasonal progression charts. The vines grew. They grew, to any casual observer, at the same rate as the Halverson block across the road. The difference that Celestine was measuring was not visible in the vines, but in the root profile, which she checked on a monthly basis by carefully extracting a single plant from its position and photographing the root ball before replanting it. The photographs showed what the journals had predicted and what the ledger had described in the precise, careful language of a woman who had looked at the same thing 31 times and knew exactly what she was seeing. The roots were deep. Not deeply elongated in the way of a water-stressed plant reaching for moisture, but thick and branched and enmeshed in a network of pale threads that extended through the surrounding medium like a circulatory system, and the soil immediately adjacent to each root mass retained its structure at depth while remaining open and non-compacting at the surface. The plants were not thirsty. They were, in the particular language of Adela Ruaro's ledger, drinking from memory. July came and the days reached 104 and 107 and once 109 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer mounted on Celestine's barn wall, and the melons in both fields swelled on their vines in the urgent compressing way of fruit that understands it has a deadline. The cooperative sent a field representative to walk the Halverson block in the second week of July, and the representative filed a report that said the crop was progressing within normal parameters and that the split fruit risk was within the range that the new infrastructure improvements had been designed to address. He did not cross the road to walk Celestine's block because her 12 acres were not the cooperative's concern, And because the conventional wisdom about her operation had by this point calcified into a regional fact, the way conventional wisdom always does, through repetition rather than verification. On the 14th of July, Celestine walked her rows at 5 in the morning and then walked the perimeter of her field and looked at the sky to the north and west, and came back to the barn and sat with her mother's ledger open to a section near the back, a section she had not read often because it addressed conditions she had not previously needed to think about, and she read it twice. Then she went to the barn, and she and Lupe worked for the next 11 days at a pace that Emilio later described to his mother as the pace of people who knew something was coming. They were completing the last preparations, not for the crop, which was already committed, but for what happened after. They were filling water storage, they were checking seals, they were making the operation ready to absorb additional capacity that it did not currently have, because the ledger's final section, written in Adela Ruaro's hand in the last summer before her health declined, was not about melons. It was about what came next, and it began with the sentence, "When the ground holds, offer what you have." The Weather Service issued its notice on the 26th of July. A heat dome was building over the interior valleys, a stationary high-pressure system of the kind that had become more common and more severe over the previous decade, and its projected duration at the peak temperature range was 11 days, and the projected overnight lows during that period would not drop below 88 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant that the melons in every field in the region would experience no nighttime cooling, no pressure release, no metabolic rest, and the internal pressure of their developing flesh against their forming rinds would build continuously, day and night, for nearly 2 weeks, and the split fruit loss for the region was projected by the cooperative's own analyst at somewhere between 18 and 35% of gross tonnage, depending on soil moisture consistency. The heat arrived on the 28th of July with the quality of a physical force, not weather, but presence, something that occupied the air and the soil and the surfaces of buildings and the breathing of every person and animal in the valley. The thermometer on Celestine's barn read 111 degrees on the afternoon of July 30th. Lupe checked the soil moisture sensors they had installed at 3 depths in her field and wrote the readings in a pocket notebook in his even, unhurried hand. And the readings were what they had expected, which was to say that they were stable at all 3 depths, which was to say that the network beneath the surface was doing what Adela's ledger had described it doing and what the journals had documented it doing and what no one in the regional cooperative system believed it was possible for a 12-acre operation with a leased barn and a propagation system built from pallet lumber to make happen across an entire planted field. The moisture was moving through the root network from depth to surface and from surface to depth in a regulated exchange that no emitter system could replicate because emitter systems delivered water from outside the root zone rather than circulating it within, and the melons were not splitting, they were swelling, they were full and tight, and the rinds were firm, and there was no visible surface cracking on any fruit in Celestine's block as of the morning of August 2nd. Across the road, the Halverson block split on August 1st. It began at the north end where the soil was sandiest, and the new emitters had struggled to achieve even distribution, and it spread through the field over the following 3 days with a progression that one of the Halverson boys described later as watching a seam open in a piece of cloth, systematic, unstoppable once started. The cooperative's field representative arrived on August 3rd and walked the rows and made calls and filed reports, and the packing shed cleared scheduling space for what it already knew would be a massive early harvest, because the alternative to harvesting a split melon early was leaving it on the vine until it became a source of disease pressure for the surrounding plants. And the choice between a split melon and a diseased field was a choice the cooperative made without pleasure but without hesitation. And so the Halverson crew went into the block on August 4th and began harvesting fruit that was technically marketable but only in the most charitable definition of that word. Fruit that would be sold to processors at commodity floor price rather than to the fresh market at the price the operation needed to cover its capital improvement loan. It was not ruin, but it was not far from ruin either, and Terence Wollstonecraft drove out on the 5th of August and stood at the edge of the road looking at the Halverson block. And then, Because the hardpan road was not wide, and he had turned around in Celestine's driveway, he looked at her block, and he stood there for a long time with his hands in his pockets. Celestine was in the field when he drove in. She was walking her rows, not urgently, because there was no urgency in a field that was holding, just the daily attention that the plants required, and that she gave them because she had learned from her mother's ledger that the gift of a system that works is the obligation to keep watching it. Wollstonecraft got out of his truck and walked to where she was crouching at the base of a vine, and he looked at the fruit, and he looked at the soil, and he looked at the vines on either side, all of them intact, all of them still swelling in the heat, none of them showing the characteristic darkening at the stem end that preceded a split. He looked at this for a while. Then he said, "None of them." She said no. He said his analysts had projected 30% or more for the valley as a whole. She said she knew. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had not understood what she was doing in the barn. She looked at the vine she had been checking and did not answer immediately. Then she said that was all right. He said it was not all right, actually, because he was the person whose job it was to understand what the growers in his district were doing, and he had failed to do that, and now he had a Halverson block in crisis and a 12-acre operation that was going to come off the vine clean during the worst heat event of the past 15 years, and he needed to know what she had done. She stood up and looked at him and said, "Come to the barn." He followed her. She showed him the trays, which were now empty and cleaned and stacked because all the material had gone into the ground the previous spring. She showed him the ledger. She showed him the journal papers she had marked. She showed him the root photographs, printed and dated and labeled in her own handwriting. He looked at all of it carefully, and with a kind of attention she had not previously seen him apply to anything in her operation, and when he was done, he sat on the workbench stool for a while and said nothing. She poured 2 cups of water from the jug she kept in the barn's cooler and set one in front of him and drank from the other herself. He said he owed her an apology. She said she was not interested in apologies at the moment because there was a harvest to organize and a lot of growers in the valley who were going to need information they did not currently have. And she had a set of propagation records and a preparation protocol that she was willing to share. And she needed to know whether the cooperative was going to help her share it or whether she was going to do it alone, which she was also capable of doing, but it would take longer, and speed was now a relevant factor. He said the cooperative would help. She nodded and went back to the field because the melons were not going to check themselves. The harvest from Celestine's 12 acres came off the vine over 8 days in the middle of August, in the full throat of the heat dome, and it ran to 411 bins of clean, uncracked fruit at full market weight. The packing shed ran it through at the front of the schedule, ahead of the distressed Halverson volume, because clean fruit moves first, and the check that came back to Celestine's operation was the largest single-season payment in the 12 acres recorded history, which was a history Adela Ruaro had maintained in a separate column of the same cloth-covered ledger. Celestine entered the number in the column and sat with it for a moment, and then closed the ledger and made a phone call. The person she called was not the bank. It was a woman who farmed 20 acres 4 miles east and who had lost 31% of her cantaloupe crop to the heat event. And Celestine told her that she had inoculum stock in reserve, because she had prepared more than she needed for 12 acres, because her mother's ledger had said to prepare more than you needed, and that she could have it at cost of materials, which was not very much, and that Lupe would come and show her crew how to prep the trays, and that they could have a full propagation system ready for next spring's transplant cycle if they started in October. The woman on the phone was quiet for a moment, and then said she did not know what to say to that. Celestine said she did not need to say anything, just get the barn ready. By the following spring, 7 operations in the valley had barn propagation systems running. By the spring after that, 22. The cooperative assigned a staff agronomist to the program, a young woman named Soledad Varga, who had written her thesis on mycorrhizal network restoration in degraded agricultural soils, and who had been filing recommendations about exactly this kind of approach for 3 years without anyone in the cooperative's management structure taking them seriously, and who arrived at Celestine's barn for the first orientation session with a copy of two of the same journal papers that Celestine had already marked, which was a coincidence that was not a coincidence at all, but simply the inevitable convergence of people who had been reading the same true thing from different directions. Wollstonecraft attended the second session and sat in the back and asked good questions and did not try to run the meeting, which Celestine noted and respected without saying so. Adela Roaro's ledger went to the Regional Agricultural Archive in the 7th year, accompanied by a formal accession document that described it as a 31-year continuous soil observation record of significant methodological and historical value. Celestine made a photocopy of the full ledger before she handed over the original, because the knowledge in it was not the kind of knowledge that should live in only one place. She kept the copy in the barn on the workbench, next to the temperature and humidity gauges, in a sealed sleeve against the dust and the moisture that the barn breathed. Emilio, who was 17 by then and who had been helping in the barn and the field every season since he was 9, asked her once if she was worried about giving the original away. She said no. He asked why not. She said because the ledger was not the knowledge. He thought about this for a moment and said, "What is the knowledge?" She looked at the trays. She said the knowledge is knowing that the ground has a longer memory than anyone in it. He wrote this down in his own notebook, which he had started keeping at 14 in imitation of a practice he had watched his whole life without being told to adopt it, and which he maintained with the same careful habit, the same dated entries, the same plain language that looked simple and held something harder and more durable than it appeared. The hog barn is still standing. The salvaged pallet trays have been replaced twice over the years with better-built versions of the same design, and the 6 painted river stones that mark Adela Roaro's original soil sampling points are still in the ground, replaced when they fade by Celestine's hand and now sometimes by Emilio's. The split fruit loss at the regional packing shed runs below 4% in most August seasons, a number that the cooperative's current management cites in its annual report as evidence of infrastructure improvement and soil health programming, which is accurate in a way that is also incomplete, in the way that institutional credit is always accurate and always incomplete. 7 miles down the hardpan road, the woman who started it keeps her records in the same column of her mother's ledger, because Adela left 40 pages blank at the back and 40 pages has so far been enough. The last entry Celestine made, in a season when the heat dome came again and the valley held better than it ever had, read as follows: 462 bins, no splits, the soil remembered. Beneath it, in the margin, in handwriting that was her own but that looked, in the particular slant of the late afternoon light through the barn door, remarkably like her mother's, she had written the thing that Adela had written and that she had been saying without saying since the first bucket of gray medium went into the first pallet tray in the first hot summer of the plan. The ground has a longer memory than anyone in it. Let yours be long enough to listen.